The history of the Book of Esther is complicated. There are several versions out there on the Book of Esther. So we have the Hebrew version, which is and then we have 3 Greek versions. We have the Septuagint, we have another Greek version, and we have Josephus' telling of the story. And each version is a little bit different. And the other versions make God explicit. And the Hebrew version, which is what we read in our Bibles, the name of God is not mentioned. So it seems to be clear that the story of the Book of Esther always raised the question of, is this just a secular story? It's a very good story. It could be, but because I think within Judaism, they filled in the blanks. So because God wasn't mentioned, like when Mordecai says, for such a time as this, step up to the place. And if you don't, God will bring help from another place. In one of the Greek versions, it says, God will bring the help from another place, right? And it's implied in the Hebrew version that we read in our Bibles, but it's not stated explicitly. So it is a very interesting question, right? There's in the Septuagint, we have a dream sequence at the beginning and ending of the books. And that anticipates the end. It sounds a little bit like the book of Daniel. And we have Esther praying and Mordecai praying. And so when it says in the version we have, Esther, they fast, but it doesn't say pray. So we assume when you fast because you're in trouble, you're also going to pray. It doesn't say that in the book of Esther. But interpreters have always assumed that Esther also prayed. And there's one beautiful early Jewish tradition that lines up the story about Esther praying with Psalm 22. Like, what would Esther have prayed? Psalm 22, where, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And I think I quite like that. I mean, here is a young, doubly orphaned kid, sex trafficked into the harem. And wouldn't you say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And then when she has to risk her life to go before the king, it's like, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And that anticipates the typology of Esther being like Christ. Harriet Livermore is an early 19th century interpreter of the Bible, and she calls Esther a messianic, a female Messiah. And I'm not comfortable myself doing full-blown typology and an allegorical reading of Esther, but Esther is like a type of Christ. I think that's a legitimate way of reading Esther. She doesn't die for her people, but she's willing to lay her life on the line, and in that way anticipates what Christ did. So the story of Esther and the story of God is an important episode. Here are the Jews in Persia, and through a number of crazy decisions of Haman, who's quite an evil guy, there's a genocidal edict. Haman is the guy who says, I don't like these people. Mordecai refuses to bow down before him, and he gets angry and explosive in his anger and tries to manipulate con the king into killing this people without even telling him who the people group are. And so Haman, it's complicated, and I think one of the ways I also bring the story of Esther into the wider story of God is to take seriously the genealogies of both Mordecai and Haman. So Mordecai is a Benjaminite linked to Saul and the earlier law in Deuteronomy to kill the Amalekites, right? And so that didn't happen, and under Saul, he didn't obey the law, and so there's an ongoing antagonism between Israel and the Amalekites that shows up again in the book of Esther in the genealogies of both Mordecai, who's tied to Saul, and Haman, who's tied to Amalek. So underpinning the story, and in fact somehow one of the ways of explaining the story is, like, how do you explain the intense hatred between these guys? And it's because it's an ancestral hatred. because it's overblown, right? Why, if you don't like one guy, why kill all Jews, right? And that the theme of holy war is also in Esther, as is and chapter 9. Esther asks for a second day of killing, right? And people think, gee, it's not great for a woman to be so bloodthirsty. But Esther's name can mean, it could be linked to Ishtar, who's the goddess of love and war. And her genealogy, like her uncle, Mordecai's, goes back to Benjamin. And there's one, I read in Harriet Livermore's commentary, this is from 1824. She says, Esther is a Benjaminite, and in Genesis 49, this prophecy of Benjamin, he's like a wolf. He's going to eat his prey and be violent and think, gee, that's Esther, right? She's like the wolf asking for a second day of killing. So there are all these wonderful allusions and ties in Esther to the rest of the story of God that make it impossible, I think, to read it as a secular story. It's a really key book in the history of the story of salvation. And it points ahead to something more has to happen, because the current situation for the Jews in this alien empire is not going to last.